afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final symphonic preview for this season. We are so thrilled to have Grant back with us again to talk about the concert coming up this weekend. We've all been working so hard and we're ready to see how it all comes together. I'm also pleased to announce that we will, at the college, be hosting the symphonic previews again for next season. So keep an eye. Symphonic or the symphony website, and you'll get all of the dates and know exactly where we're going to be in which room and which venue at what time and all those sorts of things. So thank you again for being with us today. Mr. Harwell.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, good to see you all. We actually have two pieces on our program that we're finishing our season with this year, at least the orchestral part of our season. One of them is a world premiere written by a friend of mine, someone I went to college with, who lives in Philadelphia, teaches at the Curtis Institute. And he's been very laconic about what it means, which is totally fine, but he basically just said it's inspired by the river. And he'll talk a little bit more about the piece on Saturday night. But I think when he says inspired by the river, what you hear from it is these sort of wobbly sort of motives going through, which go up into this big sort of cascading climax and then come down as the river fades off into the distance. It's a really nice piece. I've been enjoying working on it, and it's something that the Great Falls Symphony has done often for its anniversary seasons, and we wanted to do it this year as well. So bring a new piece into the world as a kind of celebration. That's time-wise, I think you could say that's about 10% of the program, with the other 90% of the program belonging to the Brahms Requiem. When we were picking pieces, I've told this story a few times. How do we want to end our 60th anniversary year? I knew two things. One, we needed to include the chorus. They've been with us almost the entire time. Two, no requiems. Nobody's dying. We need to keep this thing going. But somehow the Brahms Requiem just sort of kept coming back to me as really appropriate. And we'll talk about some of the text and what it means and why it has this kind of hopeful, sort of forward-looking feeling to it. I do say nobody's dying. You may have heard that M.A. Roberts, who essentially is our founder, godmother of the symphony, did actually pass away a week or two ago. A couple weeks now, I guess. And somehow it just feels very fitting that we can dedicate this performance to her on one of our big anniversaries. So I'd love to play you excerpts from Mike's piece, Mike Jubstrom, but of course they don't exist. No recordings do. So you'll have to wait for him to talk about the piece on Saturday night. But we'll talk a lot about Brahms today. What do we want to know about Brahms? Brahms was born in Hamburg in 1833. Hamburg is in the northern part of Germany. It's up almost basically on the sea. It's one of the main northern German ports. And it is very much not a hub of musical activity. It is a blue-collar town with all the sailors that come through. And Brahms' father is a musician in town, and he is sort of a goofy dude, I guess you could say, someone who likes to have a good time, and is perfectly content kind of piecing together this freelance life as a performer in Hamburg. Basically settles down, mainly plays the bass eventually, but he actually plays a lot of different instruments. And as I say, is not really ambitious about being a great musician, just someone who likes the life where he is. And he certainly encourages his two sons to take up music. When Brahms, the young Brahms, Johannes, says, I'd like to learn the piano, his father says, well, that's weird because you can't get into gigs as a pianist. You can't play the orchestra or anything like that. But sure, what the heck, we'll find you a piano teacher. And Brahms ends up being really, really good at the piano. Maybe not sort of Mozart, Beethoven great, not a real prodigy, but someone who really takes to it. Some combination of talent and work, whatever that is, leads him to become a very accomplished pianist at a pretty young age. And to the point where there's serious talk about, okay, maybe he can actually make a living doing this. Maybe he can be one of these touring soloists who makes some money that way. And That said, there's no real indication that he would become monumentally world famous. When he's 19, he has one of the sort of strangest experiences that you can sort of imagine for a musician, which is that he goes from being someone who's sort of locally intriguing to someone who's at least nationally famous within the space of a year, between age 19 and 20. And the way this happens is in Hamburg, he meets this guy named Remigny, who's a traveling violinist who is pretty good. He specializes in kind of pseudo-Hungarian folk music, or Hungarian pseudo-folk music, you could call it. It's kind of popular gypsy-like style of playing. And he needs someone to play piano with him, and he says, he plays with this kid, Brahms, and they say, well, let's take a tour together. Why don't you be my pianist as we go through Germany? And Brahms says, sure, I'm not doing anything. And they do a tour through Germany. Remini happened to go to school with this guy named Josef Joachim, who's about Brahms' age, a couple years older, who is one of the great virtuosos of the time, who is a real violin prodigy. He's one of the leading violinists in Europe at that time. And so he meets Josef Joachim, and they say, okay, hey, have you done anything? And Brahms plays some of his piano stuff. He's like, wow, these are really good. I know Franz Liszt, not in Weimar. Why don't you go talk to him? And so when they're in Weimar, they go to meet Franz Liszt. Brahms plays a few things for Franz Liszt. It's like, wow, these are really great. And then Joachim says, hey, you know, I know the Schumanns, Clara and Robert, in Dusseldorf. Why don't you go play this music for that? And they go and play the music in Dusseldorf for Robert and Clara. Robert is one of the leading, but basically Liszt and Schumann are the two sort of leading kind of thinkers about music and where it's going in the day. And they both write a lot. Rather, Liszt has someone write all the stuff for him, but basically it's with his name undersigning it. But Schumann has this newspaper, the New Times of Music, I guess you would call it, the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik. And he writes an article that says, Brahms is the next Beethoven. He is going to be the redeemer of all music, or something like that. It's really aggressively strong language for a kid who's written about 3 piano pieces and who nobody has ever heard of. Well, now everybody's heard of it. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Well, there's a lot to envy about that. You know, most musicians would say, wow, that would be really great if suddenly I could be world famous in that way. But what it means is Schumann has a history of saying this kind of thing about composers, and every now and then he's actually right. But nobody's assuming that just because Schumann says this, that he's correct, that Brahms is really all that. And there's also some kind of resentment. How does Schumann get to declare this when this guy hasn't even done anything yet? And we'll see for ourselves if this kid's any good. But it must have been a very weird experience, because after that he goes back home to Hamburg. He leaves Hamburg as a nobody and comes back as nationally famous. And that must have been a very strange experience, especially for the other musicians in town, right? Who knew him as this kid or probably didn't know him at all. And suddenly he's this sort of big name. And it makes the big sort of downside to this is that at a time when he should be sort of working on his craft and working on all the kinks and developing his technique, he's doing this with a huge spotlight on him. So he has no sort of private time to screw up, essentially. And he takes this very seriously. He's a very sort of serious guy in general in a lot of ways. And he takes this pressure on himself very hard. So he wants to make sure that he is great. He doesn't want to fail. He wants to write masterpieces. And so it ends up causing some difficulties with gestation. And so his first piano concerto goes through about 800 different iterations. And he goes to play it in Hanover first, and then he plays it in Leipzig, where he gets booed off the stage. For a variety of reasons. You can make a kind of an argument that it's not the most perfect piece ever written, although it's got a lot of really cool stuff in it. It's probably a little bit too radical for the conservative Leipzigers, but mostly Leipzigers are sitting there thinking, look, you're not going to tell us who's good and who's not. I mean, they're waiting for reasons to hate this piece. And they do. And so it puts Brahms in this kind of awkward professional situation where he has to try to be this great musician without having the real kind of foundation to do that. The other thing that's really awkward about this time, his early 20s, is that Schumann goes insane. He's probably already going insane. He tries to commit suicide, jumps off a bridge, jumps into the Rhine, and spends the remaining couple years of his life in a mental hospital. Brahms and Clara Schumann, who is one of the great piano virtuosos of the day, probably, almost certainly 99.99% sure fall in love. One of the things that Brahms is very good at is not telling you what he's thinking and making sure nobody else does either. He destroys a lot of his letters and tells other people to do it too. So there's a lot of sort of reading between the lines. And plus you have to look at things like, people back then, they would say, oh, I will love you for all eternity, and that they will say that to like their casual friends. So it's hard to know exactly what people are thinking at any given time. But it does seem very clear that they are in love with each other. We just have no idea how that manifested itself or how far it went or things like that. Really awkward since Robert's not dead, but he is in an insane asylum and nobody's allowed to go see him, least of all Clara. You know, score one for 19th century medicine. But you know, every once a year, the doctors will let Brahms go visit him or something like that. But he's in love with this great musician, the wife of the man who made his name, and that's a very interesting dynamic to say the least. What's odd about this, Brahms is a pianist, and at no point would you suggest that he would go hard into vocal music. That's not really what you might expect from that. But a couple things sort of conspire to push him in that direction. One is, if he's going to be a great composer, he's going to learn the kind of technique of doing it the best way he knows how. And the most impressive thing, the most sort of unassailable technique is counterpoint. That's something that you can do well. Even if you don't like the music, you can admire how well it's crafted. And so he goes hard into studying counterpoint. Basically, this is the study of if you take two melodies and put them on top of each other and they interact in cool ways. And Bach was supremely great at this. It's the kind of thing that if you want to impress your friends, you write really great counterpoint. And Brahms, to the day he died, would be obsessed with counterpoint and would study it and would become one of the greatest at it who ever lived. But what that means is he's looking at a lot of old music and he's looking at a lot of vocal music, because a lot of this Palestrina 16th, 17th, 18th century music, all of this really dense, interesting counterpoint is religious vocal music. So he's studying a lot of that repertoire, even though, again, that's not sort of directly tied into the way he's making his money at that time, which is sort of going around and playing piano recitals and things like that. The other part of this is that he sort of falls into a couple of gigs as a choir conductor. He gets hired at this court in Detmold, where part of his job is to direct a choir. He goes back home to Hamburg for a while, and there's this women's choir who all of them immediately fall in love with him. He was a very handsome young man, and they say, well, why don't we start a women's choir? And so he's working with voices all the time, and he writes a lot of this music for voice as well. The other thing I think that's really helpful about that is that he can do those things out of the spotlight. He's not going to tour to a Leipzig audience and impress the world with a folk song arrangement for women or something like that. That's not the kind of thing that's going to make the newspapers or anything like that. So that gives him kind of a less pressure-filled way into composition, into developing, again, his own abilities as a composer. And so vocal music would actually take a primacy in his life that he wouldn't automatically have seen coming when he was 19 or 20 years old. What's interesting about that, so let's see here. as he's sort of touring around and not particularly stable in his life, getting into his late 20s, the job for the Hamburg Philharmonic opens. And this is the job he wants. He wants to conduct that orchestra. And he says, you know what, I'm going to take a little trip to Vienna. I haven't been there. All these great musicians are there. It'll be a lark. I'll come back in a few months. While he's down there, they offer the job of the Hamburg Philharmonic to somebody else, actually a singer that Brahms knows and likes a lot. And the end result of that is that it sort of reframes those two cities in his life. Instead of living in Hamburg and occasionally going to Vienna, he lives in Vienna and occasionally comes back to Hamburg. And he would essentially be Viennese, more or less, till his dying day. As I say, Brahms was always wanting to write masterpieces. He wasn't into sort of casual or light music, especially. And he always wanted to write the way he wrote. So he never wrote commissions, he never took commissions. He would write pieces and he would offer them to people and see if he could get people to bite. And often they did. And so when we're looking at inspirations for the German Requiem, it's a little bit convoluted, actually. Certainly there's no kind of instigating event the way there is for, say, the Mozart Requiem, which is that really mysterious commission that he gets from a guy who wants to pass it off as his own work. In Brahms' case, it's something that is a project that he's been thinking about for a long time because it has interest for him. Again, it's got, as a sacred choral piece, it reflects his interest in music of Bach and things like that. Some of the motives go back actually to Schumann and his death and insanity. A lot of people will say he started his work in earnest in the mid-60s, right after his mother died. And a lot of people will talk about that, his mother dying as this kind of catalyzing event. And it probably was, but Brahms would never admit that, never admit anything about these sorts of things. And certainly he might have written it anyway, although it might have taken a different shape. I suppose at some point his mother was going to die. That's a thing that happens. But whether or not it's really truly a result of that death or how it's shaped by that death is actually kind of hard to know. What we do know, and what's sort of odd about it in thinking about it, is that this is the first great public success that he has in his career. So the thing that he would have liked his first piano concerto to be ends up being this piece. And for a piece which is about dying, a piece which is big, monumental, it seems like it should have been written by an older guy. But he writes it when he's basically 34-ish. Is that right? No, even younger, 32. It's about 1865, 1866 when he's writing this piece. And it's, again, it seems weird to kind of start the best part of his career with this piece rather than having a great career and then having this piece kind of a culminating kind of piece to it. That seems backwards to me. But that's the way it worked out in his life. This is the thing that really kicks off his, the thing that kind of justifies all that stuff that Schumann said about him in the first place. So let's listen to some of it. So, as I say, well, first let's talk text. It's called a German Requiem because it's in German. Brahms was not the best of Christians, let's put it that way. Not a consistent churchgoer, things like that. He certainly wouldn't have genuflected to priests or anything like that. Of course, being North German, he was Protestant, so he wouldn't have done that anyway. Very much coming from that Lutheran tradition of we can read the Bible for ourselves and figure out, find our own meanings in it and things like that. And he chooses his own text. So the Requiem text in the Latin Mass has its own set text and things like that. Brahms doesn't use any of them. There's some kind of echoes of it in here that we'll talk about a little bit. But that's not really what's going on. He picks ones that just he finds meaningful himself. And as in 1868, when they're about to premiere it in Bremen, the conductor who's preparing the piece for him says, you know, it'd be really nice if this thing mentioned Jesus. And Brahms says, yeah, that's fine, I don't need to do that. And so it's a requiem that has text from both the Old and New Testament, but there's no actual mention of Jesus or anything in that regard. And Brahms says, this is really more of a human requiem. It's about our experience down on earth more than anything else. So, when we start with this text that's Selig sind die da Leidtragen. Blessed be those that carry sorrow. And we get this first little choral passage. It starts like this. Selig sind, blessed be. And again, Brahms, always looking to be a great composer. So he's always going to find ways of combining notes in interesting ways, almost like Easter eggs. But the first three notes we hear in that choral part, we will hear 7 billion times in 7 billion versions during the course of this piece. They show up constantly. Two, maybe three main motives that show up over and over and over again. So let's take a quick listen. A quick listen. There's no such thing as a quick listen to the Brahms Requiem. No violins in this movement, kind of an interesting sort of darkening of the orchestral color. Orchestra gets this. But you have to include trombones. That's a rule. If you have a sacred choral work, trombones are the sacred instrument going back hundreds of years. They often play doubling the vocal parts, although Brahms doesn't always use them that way. Text, I'll read the entirety of the first movement of this text. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Though they that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth forth and weepeth, bearing precious seed, that's this section that we're about to hear, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him. Not only does that not mention Jesus, that doesn't even mention God. Right? This is, again, a very kind of human experience of death. We won't mention the Lord until several minutes into the second movement. Those that sow in tears shall reap in joy. So the second movement includes some of the older music that Brahms had been percolating with for years, some of which was inspired probably by Schumann's death, and also inspired by a Lutheran hymn. This main tune bears some striking resemblance to a hymn tune from the 1600s that Bach used. And it also, again, we'll talk about some of the funky ways that he uses some of his motives. The text here, for all flesh is as grass, and the glory of man is like the flowers of grass, in that it all dies and goes away. And so we will hear this opening. It's kind of a funeral march in 3/4 time. Sorry, I need to find the actual time. Drums. Gras, then all flesh is as grass. Grass is verdorrt, it has withered, and the flowers have fallen off. So we're going to skip ahead just a little bit because there is good news, and this good news is, we get to talk about God finally. Aber das Herrn Wort bleibt in Ewigkeit. But the word of the Lord remains in eternity. And suddenly, after all this kind of calm, solemn, serious music, you get to be loud. The trombones get to play loud with the choir. With great joy, we declare that passage. It's not quite a fugue in the traditional sense, but this is Brahms being a good composer. He's writing lots of really interesting, intricate counterpoint during the next passage, where with great celebration we say that the saved of the Lord, I don't know how they translate it in here, the ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. They shall obtain great joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. And so we get this really uplifting, joyous, what's the word, sort of, again, these lines sort of cascading all over the top of each other. But because it's Brahms, there's also important composer stuff to talk about. Namely, this tune, starts with these three notes. 3, 5, 1. 3 notes of the major triad, whatever you want to call it. Those notes are going to become a really big deal, almost as big a deal as those first 3 notes of movement 1. They're going to show up over and over again, to the point where I'm not going to point out them all because we would stop every 5 seconds if we did it that way. But anyway, this Die Erlösung des Herrn. Again, this is Brahms being very old school with the intricacies of the counterpoint and how they all combine together. But again, the attitude is still there. This very celebratory, joyous music as well. I do have to point out one thing. This text, Die Erlösung des Herrn, werden wieder kommen und geht sie an, kommen mit Jauchzen. The way that's usually translated is shouts of joy, but somehow shouts of joy doesn't really communicate the word like Jauchzen. Kommen mit Jauchzen, which just sounds like yelling, right? But essentially that's what it means. Yes, they will come with yauks, whatever that is. Like everybody else at that time was obsessed with Beethoven, and if you're obsessed with Beethoven, there's a special meaning to having the choir say Freude, 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 Freude over and over again, just like they did in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Joy. I promise you not too much stopping, but this is a real common Brahms game that we're about to play. Does it all the time. And what it is this. You take a melody, and then you take the melody half as fast. do them at the same time. So. Loves doing that. It's not the only time that this will happen in this piece alone. But that idea, it's kind of a cool thing to do, to construct a melody that if you play it at one speed and then you play it at half speed, you can actually put them together at the same time and end up with something that sounds actually kind of good. That's what's about to happen here. Our sopranos and tenors are going to do that for you. And this quiet, mysterious music is pain and sighing. Future Bag will be gone. More pain and sighing. Schmerz. But again, it will be gone. Wird weg. Eternal joy is going to lead us to this sort of great peace. We're about to be introduced to our baritone soloist. It's not completely consistent this way, but Brahms likes to use his soloists when we start talking in first person. So this text here is, Lord, make me to know that dass ein Ende mit mir haben muss, that there must be an end with me, that my life must end, and that is the point, I guess. That is the goal. As always, there's always a second thing going on with Brahms, and the main tune to this is You may remember this from this. Again, it's everywhere. Teach me that there must be an end to my life. Days are but a handspan to you. And my life is like nothing to you. Well, we'll skip ahead now. Just like in the second movement, there's a happy ending here, which is, but the souls of the righteous are in God's hand, and there shall be no torment for them. Nothing will touch them. And again, we get this sort of joyous fugue that celebrates this. A couple of interesting things about this fugue. First of all, this note happens the entire time. It never leaves. The timpanist is going during this entire gigantic fugue. If you play bass or bass trombone or tuba or any of those instruments, you know that your part goes D, D, forever and ever and ever, amen. The other thing that's interesting about this fugue is, man, is it miserable to sing. And one thing, Brahms did have all of this great choral conducting experience. He did have a lot of sort of hands-on experience with voice, but he also did have this sort of Beethoven quality to really write instrumentally for voices at times. And so the lines in this fugue are very angular. The fugue subject jumps all over the place, has a really wide range, and it's a challenging part to sing, that's for sure. Again, this is Brahms, so there's going to be something hidden in there, which is this. Which you may remember from the very first, there's always something like that in there. So we're going to prepare our fugue with this this passage, "My hope is in you, Lord." Timing. Apparently the first time this was ever played in public, they only played the first three movements, and the timpanists just went nuts at the end of this. And so the basic response was, well, I really liked most of it, but at the end it was just a bunch of percussion. I didn't understand what was going on. But eventually they cleared up that dynamic issue. I'd love to talk tons about movements 4 and 5, but I won't. I'll just mention a couple brief things about them. Movement 4 is the one that's most often played. It's this "Wie lieblich instead of Wohnungen." How lovely are your dwelling place. Dwelling places, O Lord, is how it's usually translated. And it has this melody. You may remember these notes from this. But you might also remember these notes. Which is this. Upside down. And I think those people who really love Brahms, that's something that they really admire about him, is that this tune, which seems very sort of gentle and easy and flowing, sort of hides all of these really cool, crafty thematic relationships within it. But this movement, it has that kind of simple feel, but of course it's always deceptive simplicity with Brahms. Well, it's the next thing, isn't it? Okay, I'm sorry I have to do this. That little intro you just heard is upside down what the choir is about to sing. And again, you don't think of it in terms of, wow, he's really doing all this academic kind of stuff. It just sounds like a nice tune. Love to listen to more, but we have to talk about 6, because 6 is what is known as the good one. And 5 is gorgeous too, and there's cool stuff. There's another one of those things where he writes the same melody twice at 2 different rates, and it somehow still fits together, and things like that. And that's where the soprano sings. It's the one that's all about, I will comfort you the way one is comforted by one's mother, which again, a lot of people sort of give significance to Brahms' mother's death around this time. The unfortunate thing is that he actually wrote this movement much later and didn't originally consider it as part of the conception of the piece. So make of that as you will. I mentioned before that, well, this doesn't take the doesn't use the traditional Latin Catholic Mass text. There is some reflection of that in certain places. And Movement 6 acts as the Dies Irae, the day of wrath, where the trumpets raise the dead, and things like that. It's not exactly the same text, but it's got echoes of that in there. They talk about the day of the last trombone, hosanna, as a sort of cop-out kind of translation of an instrument which sort of didn't exist, the sort of old school pre-valve bugle thing that they would have been talking about at the time. But yes, lots of good stuff happens in Movement 6. So let's start with our day of the last trombone, where, of course, the trombones are playing, because why wouldn't you do that? Trombones, you can see them. Again, I promised I wouldn't do this too much, but I'm going to do it a little. He's going to sing this, which you may remember from the way that the second movement ended, right? It is all over the place. I try to yell it over the music. Der Tod ist beschlungen in den Sieg. Death is swallowed up in victory, is the text here. Death, where's your sting? Where is your victory? Now we get the giganticest fugue of them all. Our fugue subject is here. Herr, du bist würdig zu nehmen Preis und Ehre und Kraft. Herr, you are worthy to take praise and honor and might. You may remember this. Same three notes but backwards. Not to mention, you may remember from this. Again, it's everywhere. And because Brahms is being a great composer here, he's going to do a lot of what is called stretto. Usually when you take a fugue, you have one entrance here and the next entrance is here. Stretto just means to put them really close together. And by the end of this, it's really, really close together. 2 beats, in fact. So you have somebody singing this. And by the time they get to the second note, the next voice is already entered. And it keeps on going up the scale. And in fact, it goes like this. Each new entrance, every 2 beats. This is Brahms showing off. The effect is this. Builds and builds and builds and builds. But yes. we're coming up on that really tight stretto. Kind of cool. And then movement 7 happens. I know I'm over time, but are there things people want to talk about?
I have a question. Is there an English word for requiem?
Direct translation of that word, I would say it's probably requiem. I think we've borrowed it sufficiently to count as that. But
Will the English be projected on the screen?
yes, you will see the English. And this piece is often sung in English. People will justify that by saying, it's presented in the vernacular, right? It's for the language that the people spoke. And I think there's something to that. I just love the way some of these German words sound. And you don't get quite kind of that same feel in English. But you'll know what's going on, for sure.
What's the venue of this performance?
It's at Mansfield. Oh, of this one?
Yeah.
I don't know where that is.
Or who?
It's the DKSO. The artisan?
Yeah, so Blomstedt, I've actually shown some of his videos before just because he's a really sort of happy, smiley looking dude. But yeah, it's a Danish radio symphony. So I don't know, maybe Copenhagen or something.
If it's of any interest, he's the former San Francisco Symphony director, where I actually performed under him in the San Francisco Symphony Chorus and recorded Mahler's second. So Great Falls to San Francisco.
All right, well, thanks, everyone.